Between the shadowed backroads of rural Pennsylvania and the rugged fringe of the Appalachian Trail lies a stretch of land that defies documentation. The towns here are small, the roads narrow, the forests thick and old. Generations of families have lived in the region, yet even among those who've spent their whole lives there, few can agree on where exactly the so-called forgotten town begins, or if it even exists at all. Maps don't show it. GPS systems reroute away from it. Satellite images show only blurred stretches of treetops or what appears to be blank fields. There are no marked roads, no coordinates, no official records. And yet, scattered across decades, the stories persist. The first known record dates back to 1953. That summer, the Morris family, David and Eliza, along with their 2 young children, Sarah and Matthew, were driving home from a family gathering. They were seen by relatives and later at a small gas station, where they asked for directions after taking an unfamiliar road. The gas station attendant remembered them clearly. A family of 4, cheerful, slightly lost, but not in any apparent trouble. They drove off into the evening, and that was the last anyone ever saw of them. When the Morris family was reported missing days later, local police launched a search. They traced the route the family was thought to have taken, combed the roads, questioned locals, even searched nearby woods and ravines, but they found nothing. No tire tracks, no wreckage, no signs of foul play. It was as if the Morris family had simply been absorbed by the land. The incident became a local mystery, quietly filed away and spoken about only in hushed tones over the years. But it didn't stop there. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, similar disappearances rippled across the area. A pair of college students on a camping trip, a delivery driver whose last call came from a roadside payphone that no longer exists, a mother and daughter visiting family, vanishing somewhere between towns. The stories began accumulating, small and scattered at first, and then forming an unsettling pattern. Descriptions from those few who narrowly escaped or had strange encounters always circled back to the same strange landmarks. A town with no name, sometimes glimpsed at dusk or dawn, where a white church with a missing cross stands on a hill, where gas pumps stand rusted and forgotten, stuck showing prices from the 1960s, where narrow streets wind and curve without reason, and where windows watch even though no lights are on inside. Detective Alton Graves spent over 30 years working rural cases. By his retirement, his office had transformed into what colleagues jokingly called the conspiracy cave, a maze of string maps, missing persons photos, handwritten notes, and marked-up road maps pinned to the walls. But to Graves, it was no joke. He noticed something others didn't. Graves began charting the disappearances, drawing lines between cases across the decades, noting the landmarks people had reported. When the lines were connected, they formed a perfect shape, a rough pentagon centered over an area where, in the 1920s, a mining town had been abandoned after a collapse. Officially, the town was evacuated, dissolved, and absorbed into the surrounding counties. But Graves suspected that wasn't the whole story. In 2009, a young journalist named Cara Delgado took interest in the rumors while researching an article on strange American legends. Cara was known for her meticulous work and fearless reporting. She interviewed locals, read old police files, followed leads across towns. Eventually, she set off alone one evening, determined to find the place people whispered about. 3 days later, she was found walking barefoot along a rural highway, by, disoriented, dehydrated, her clothes torn, and her camera missing. She could recall only flashes, standing under a flickering street lamp beside a stone well, hearing faint music from a record player, walking past a house where she saw her own face looking back at her from a window. Kara was hospitalized, diagnosed with acute psychosis, and left journalism soon after. Despite multiple requests, she has never spoken publicly about what happened. In 2014, a Reddit thread reignited attention. The post was titled simply, "Who else has found the town that's not on the map?" Within days, hundreds of comments flooded in from across the country. People shared stories, hikers who had lost hours after stepping off familiar trails, travelers who followed road signs they swore weren't there before, only to end up in dead ends or places that didn't make sense. Families who passed through small towns, only to realize those towns didn't exist on any state registry. Common details began to emerge, a faint smell of smoke on the wind, even with no fire nearby. Old-fashioned music playing faintly carried on air that was unnaturally still. Street signs with names no one could pronounce. A growing sense of being watched, of being followed, of stepping just slightly outside of what should be real. By this point, the tone around the stories had changed. What once had been whispered as a cautionary tale or dismissed as coincidence now carried a weight, a dread that pressed down harder with each new account. Some places, the stories suggested, aren't just forgotten. They erase themselves on purpose, and maybe they do so not because they were abandoned or left behind, but because they were never meant to be found in the first place. It was late autumn when veteran trucker Bill Wesson found himself on a lonely stretch of road in rural Pennsylvania, a route he had driven for years without a second thought. Bill had seen it all. Long nights crossing state lines, bad weather, empty highways, and the occasional wildlife darting across his beams. But on this night, something gnawed at him, a sensation he later struggled to put into words. He'd chosen to take a familiar shortcut along a service road, a narrow, cracked path skirting the edge of dense woods. As he drove, the air outside grew colder, a biting cold, sharper than anything the season should have brought. Inside his cab, the radio had been humming softly with static. Bill reached to adjust the dial when suddenly the crackle sharpened and a voice came through, clear but wrong. "This is WXLJ, bringing you the evening sounds of 1957. Bill froze. That call sign, that was impossible. WXLJ hadn't existed for decades, shut down long before he was born. But before he could react, music drifted through the speakers, an old rockabilly song, the kind his father used to play on battered vinyl. He stared at the radio, wondering if it was some quirky rebroadcast, a retro program. That's when he saw it. Up ahead, a soft glow cut through the darkness, a small diner, its neon sign sputtering unevenly, the letters, "Welcome Home," blinking faintly through the mist. Bill's headlights swept over the building, showing checkerboard tile along the front, red bar stools inside, and a lone figure moving behind the counter. Bill's chest tightened. He knew this road. There was no diner here. Not last year, not 10 years ago, not ever. Against his better judgment, he slowed, pulling his truck to the shoulder. He rubbed his eyes, glanced back up. The diner was still there. The neon flickered as if struggling to stay lit. But when he blinked, when his eyelids loosed for just a fraction of a second, it was gone. No diner, no neon, no faint music, only the empty road, stretching ahead, and a dense wall of trees lining both sides, shrouded in an uneasy stillness. Bill sat frozen, hands gripping the wheel, heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He told himself it was a trick of the light, exhaustion, maybe a dream creeping in at the edges of a long haul. But part of him knew even then that he had seen something he was never meant to see. Elsewhere, another story was unfolding. Jane Yu, an avid hiker and amateur photographer, had set out for a weekend trail she knew well. Born and raised in the region, Jane wasn't easily spooked by woods or local legends. She carried maps, a compass, her phone, and had a solid sense of direction. But that weekend, something was off. The trail seemed familiar at first, the same winding dirt path, the tall oaks and maples overhead, the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. But as she pressed deeper, Jane noticed subtle changes. The trees grew too close together. The canopy overhead thickened unnaturally, and the sunlight dimmed faster than it should have, casting long, unnatural shadows across the ground. She thought maybe she'd taken a wrong turn, so she doubled back. That's when she noticed the smell. A sharp, choking scent of burning wood, though there was no fire, no smoke. Jane paused, straining to listen. At first, she heard only her own breath, the soft rustle of wind. But then came something else, a faint, distant sound, almost like crying. High-pitched, wavering sobs just at the edge of hearing. She called out, but there was no response. She waited, heart thudding, but the sound only grew fainter, slipping away like a dream you can't quite hold on to. Determined to return to familiar ground, Jane turned around, only to realize the trail behind her had changed. Where there had been flat ground, the earth now sloped sharply to where there had been clearings. Tangled undergrowth blocked her path. She walked faster, then broke into a run, panic mounting as every turn brought her deeper into unfamiliar territory. That's when she saw the signs. Small, rusted metal plaques nailed to tree trunks. But the words weren't in English. They weren't in any language Jane recognized. Some were barely readable, letters faded or covered by moss. Others were fresh, shining, as if they'd been placed only hours before. She stopped in front of one, the characters twisting and curling in ways her mind couldn't quite process. She reached out to touch it, then recoiled, heart hammering in her chest. Jane eventually stumbled out onto a service road hours later, exhausted, disoriented, her sense of time fractured. When she checked her phone's GPS log, she was stunned. She had been circling an area barely a mile wide for over 3 hours. Her story was one of many. Reports began to surface over the years from people across different backgrounds. Truckers, hikers, local farmers, travelers just passing through. Each described strange, unplaceable landmarks, roads that stretched longer than they should, lights flickering where no towns should exist, faint voices in the dark, shadows darting at the edges of their vision, clocks that froze, radios that played old broadcasts. Each account seemed to share one haunting element, the feeling of being guided, drawn, step by something they couldn't name, something just beyond their understanding. They were being led, slowly and surely, away from the world they knew. Have you ever felt you were being led somewhere, but you didn't know by what? In 2011, a determined group of 5 investigators, calling themselves Spectra Deep, set out to uncover what many dismissed as rumor. the existence of the forgotten town, the place without a name, a place where people were said to disappear. They weren't amateurs. They had spent months researching, cross-referencing old police records, interviewing families of the missing, and collecting GPS data from past encounters. Their leader, Ethan Shaw, was a seasoned investigator who had built a reputation in underground paranormal circles. Alongside him was Anna Riley, the team's tech specialist, Marcus Lee, a local historian, Jenna Blake, an audio expert, and Scott Mayers, their camera operator. For months, they planned. On a crisp autumn day, with recording equipment, EMF detectors, and satellite phones in hand, they entered the dense forest believed to lie near the town's edge. They started their journey under overcast skies, the weak afternoon sun filtering through tangled branches. Birds were quiet. The forest floor was damp, giving off the deep, earthy smell of decaying leaves. For several hours, they walked steadily, tracking coordinates they believed aligned with past sightings. Ethan kept a notebook in his pocket, cross-checking every landmark, every faint trail, every unexplained footprint in the soil. As dusk approached, their satellite phones lost signal. This wasn't unexpected. The terrain was rough, the forest deep. But then, the GPS trackers they carried began malfunctioning. Devices that had been reliable all day suddenly glitched, freezing or blinking 4:44 p.m. repeatedly. That was the last external record from the team. 3 days later, a search party found Anna Riley alone on a crumbling access road. Barefoot, her feet torn and bloody, her skin covered in scratches, her eyes wide and unfocused. She was dehydrated, shivering despite the mild temperature. The paramedics wrapped her in blankets, asking gently where she'd been, what had happened. She only whispered, again and again, "We knocked, and it opened." No trace of Ethan, Marcus, Jenna, or Scott was ever found. What was clear to those who knew the case was that this wasn't an isolated event. Anna's survival added a grim layer to an already long chain of disappearances, and the details she could recall, though fragmented and confused, matched too closely with previous reports to ignore. Detective Alton Graves, though long retired, followed the story closely. For years, he had been charting disappearances across the area. When he began to connect them on a map, he saw something both eerie and undeniable. The points where people had last been seen formed a precise shape, a five-sided figure that enclosed an area once home to a mining town that vanished from records after a disaster in the 1920s. Officially, the town had collapsed due to an underground fire, its residents evacuated and relocated. But Graves' research suggested no such relocation existed. It was as if the town, its buildings, its people, its very memory, had simply been erased. As Graves delved deeper, more unsettling patterns emerged. Witnesses who had narrowly escaped encounters spoke of the sky dimming too early, the sunlight pulled away as if something were drawing it inward. One man described how the light around him turned sluggish, like wading through honey, the weight of the air pressing against his chest. Another reported hearing faint, scratchy music, tunes that sounded like they belonged to another era. Soft swing, crackling jazz, voices through a distant gramophone. Clocks and watches all stopped at 4:44 p.m. Digital devices blinked uselessly. Phones froze. Dashboard clocks in cars reset to zero. Time in that place simply refused to cooperate. Adding to the tension were the SY bowls. Throughout the region, People began noticing trees marked with odd carvings, rough, almost childlike drawings of trees turned upside down, their roots stretching skyward. Some of the marks were so fresh the bark still bled sap. Others were ancient, barely distinguishable from the scars of time. Along forest paths, faint footprints appeared overnight, too small for an adult, too erratic for an animal, sometimes circling back on themselves as if whoever or whatever left them had gotten lost. And then there were the dreams. Jane Yu, the hiker who had survived her own encounter, later told a journalist that she began dreaming of a white church after her experience. She had never seen it in person, but in her dreams, it appeared vivid and real. A small, whitewashed building, the bell tower leaning slightly, the bell inside cracked clean through. She would stand outside its door, unable to move forward, hearing whispers calling her name from within. Other survivors reported the same. Dreams of the church, of walking through fields under a sunless sky, of standing before the broken bell. Some awoke trembling, soaked in sweat. Others claimed the dreams returned night after night, growing more vivid, more urgent, until they could no longer tell if they were asleep or awake. And then, eventually, some of them simply disappeared. No investigation, no search party, no tracing call logs or bank accounts ever recovered them. They were just gone. By this stage, it was no longer possible to call these events coincidence. The forgotten town had a pull, a pattern, a presence. It was not just a place people stumbled into. It was a place that called, reaching through radios and dreams, twisting light and time, leading those who heard its call, step by step, away from their world and towards something else. The question that now haunted everyone paying attention was simple and terrible. Why? Why were these people chosen? Why had the town been wiped from records, maps, and memory? And why, after all these years, did it still reach out, as if waiting, inviting more to follow? In 2019, Lex Hall, a rising star on YouTube, set his sights on a challenge few dared approach, an on-camera exploration of the so-called forgotten town. Lex wasn't just another urban explorer with a camera. He was known for pushing limits. He had filmed himself navigating collapsed factories, forgotten military bunkers, even crossing into off-limits zones. His audience adored him for his bravado, his calm narration in the face of decaying walls and flickering lights. But this time, even his most devoted fans expressed unease in the comments when he teased his latest destination. Lex had been gathering clues for months, piecing together coordinates pulled from scattered online posts, whispered tips, and a handful of blurred photographs allegedly tied to the town that didn't appear on any map. He planned a live stream to prove, once and for all, whether the legends were real. The title of the event, scheduled for October 13th, was simple: The Town They Told Me Not to Find. The stream began a little after midnight. Lex appeared on camera, his face lit by the faint blue glow of his phone screen. He spoke softly to the audience, excitement lacing his words as he panned his camera around the darkened forest. Crickets chirped faintly in the background, though every so often they seemed to fall unnaturally silent. Viewers in the chat watched closely, their comments rolling in at dizzying speed. For the first hour, the exploration looked like any other. Lex followed faint trails through the trees, stopping occasionally to mark his location, to call out landmarks, or to react with a low laugh when the audience egged him on. But as the night wore on, his voice began to change. He whispered that the air felt wrong, thicker, heavier. He paused repeatedly to check his watch, his GPS, frowning at how the readings seemed frozen. His flashlight flickered over unfamiliar shapes, a toppled road sign with no letters, rusting gas pumps buried in weeds, the skeletal frame of a building long abandoned. At 2:12 a.m., something caught the camera's focus. Lex's beam swung forward and landed on a crumbling cobblestone marker partially buried under vines and dirt. He brushed it off carefully, revealing faint, weathered letters. "You shouldn't be here." The chat exploded. Dozens, then hundreds of comments flooded in. Lex let out a shaky breath, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he muttered, "It's real." His hand trembled slightly, the camera shaking, and then the stream distorted. The video feed stuttered and froze, pixelating into blocks of green and gray. For a heartbeat, the frame cleared just long enough to show distant shapes, a row of small houses, their roofs sagging, their windows dark. On the porch of one stood a figure. No, several figures. They faced the camera directly, motionless. Their faces were pale, smooth, featureless. Lex's breathing grew louder, quicker. His flashlight swung wildly as he turned sharply, the beam briefly sweeping across a tall, narrow clock tower, rising in the distance. Its hands moved backward, ticking against time. The chat, still rolling at rapid speed, filled with panicked messages. "Lex, get out! Leave now!" What was that? The audio cracked, twisting into low, warped sounds, and then, just before the screen went black, a voice emerged through the distortion, faint, layered over itself, mechanical and ancient all at once. "One more stays. One more stays." The live stream ended. By morning, Lex's van was found abandoned on a gravel pull-off near the forest edge. His equipment was gone. His last GPS signal had been logged miles into terrain with no roads. No further trace of him was ever found. For many, Lex's disappearance was just another internet mystery. But for those who had spent years studying the region, people like retired Detective Alton Graves, it confirmed their worst suspicions. Graves, now in his 70s, was known among a small circle of investigators and locals as the one person who had nearly mapped the town's reach. But in early 2022, something happened to him he had never publicly shared until that year. While driving a rural back road, Graves's GPS glitched, rerouting him through a route he didn't recognize. He followed it without thinking, only realizing something was wrong when the trees around him grew unfamiliar. The light dimmed prematurely, and the road under his tires turned to uneven stone. Graves described passing through a place that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. Houses with warped angles, buildings that stood at the edge of his vision but twisted out of shape when he turned to face them directly. He saw figures on porches, people, or the suggestion of people, staring with smooth, blank faces. Windows reflected no light. Doors hung open, but led only to darkness. At the center, he saw the clock tower, taller than it had any right to be, its hands grinding backwards, the gears clicking audibly in the heavy stillness. Panicking, Graves whipped the car around, speeding back the way he had come. Yet when he glanced in the rearview mirror, the road behind him stretched on endlessly. He gripped the wheel, muttering prayers he hadn't spoken in years, until without any clear transition, he found himself back on the main road. He pulled over, chest heaving, his heart racing so hard he thought he might collapse. The trip, he realized, had taken only 40 minutes, but his dashboard clock read 4:44 p.m. Graves kept what happened to himself for months. But when news of Lex's disappearance surfaced, when the details began aligning with too many past cases, he knew. He knew what the others before him had been pulled into, what they had been claimed by, because the truth was becoming clearer with every missing person. Every frozen clock, every warped live stream. The town wasn't abandoned. It wasn't even a town in the human sense. It was something alive. A presence, ancient and patient, not tied to land or bricks or wood, but to memory, to thought, to human curiosity. It didn't feed on flesh. It fed on stories, on the lives and identities of those it lured across its threshold. Every person who crossed its borders, every person it called by name, was taken in and absorbed, becoming part of its shape, its legend, its hunger, and it was still waiting, calling, always calling, reaching farther. One more stays, one more stays. Always. Weeks after his last recorded interview, retired Detective Alton Graves was gone. He had agreed to speak with a small independent documentary crew, recounting the details of his strange experience, the warped streets, the backward-moving clock tower, the faceless figures. He had been clear that the town was no myth, no campfire story spun out of control. He believed it was something alive, something ancient, and he warned, with tired eyes, that it would not stop pulling people in. A few weeks later, when the documentary team returned to follow up, they found Graves's apartment door ajar. Inside, the place had been turned upside down. His carefully arranged notes, his wall of maps, his decades of records, all torn down, much of it burned in a pile in the center of the room. Neighbors reported hearing nothing, seeing no one. Graves himself was missing. His car still parked out front, his keys on the table. No body, no trace, no farewell. Around the same time, Cara Delgado, the journalist who had vanished for days back in 2009 and emerged shattered, quietly published a final post on her long-abandoned blog. It was short, only 2 lines. If you see a diner with a single red light on the roof, don't stop. Turn around. No story is worth it. Hours later, the blog was deleted, and her social media accounts were wiped clean. She has not been publicly heard from since. As public attention flared around Lex Hall's disappearance, official channels began to push back. Authorities denied any unusual patterns of missing persons in the area. Freedom of Information Act requests, filed by independent researchers, returned empty, records either missing or heavily redacted. Local police dismissed the incidents as internet myths, online hysteria fanned by viral videos and amateur ghost hunters. But survivors, the few who came back shaken, confused, changed, quietly told a different, story. They agreed on one chilling point. It's not just that the town can't be found. It chooses who finds it. Some speculate that the place is a government black site, an experimental zone closed off and hidden, protected by layers of bureaucratic silence. Others believe it's a kind of dimensional rift, an accidental tear between worlds, a thin place where time, matter, and memory no longer obey ordinary rules. But those who have stood at the edge, who have glimpsed its strange streets or heard its cracked bell, describe something simpler and far more terrifying. The town calls, not to everyone, only to those it marks, those it singles out. It reaches through dreams, through faint radio whispers, through glitched GPS signals and fading road signs. It draws the curious, the searching, the reckless, those hungry for answers or adventure or proof. And once you've felt its pull, Once you've seen even a hint of its borders, you are never truly safe again. It waits, it watches, it calls you back. No one knows how long it has been there or how many it has claimed. What is certain is that the pattern has not stopped. And if you think this story is just a tale to scare late-night listeners, remember, there are roads you can take right now that don't appear on any map. Roads you might stumble onto by accident. And if you do, if you see a light glowing faintly through the trees, or a building standing where no building should be, or a sign half buried in dirt that seems to whisper warnings, turn around. Don't look back. Don't listen when it calls your name. So if your GPS ever goes silent, if the trees grow a little too thick, and if a road appears that wasn't there yesterday, don't follow it. Because once you enter the forgotten town, once you cross that invisible line, you may never remember who you were before. You may think you're just exploring, just passing through, just curious. But that place, it doesn't let go. It takes pieces of you you'll never get back. And if you listen too closely, you'll hear it calling, softly, patiently, waiting for you to answer. Have you or someone you know ever experienced something like this? Tell us in the comments below. We want to hear your story. And if you want more true horror, more unsettling stories drawn from the edges of what we can explain, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss the next shadow creeping behind the truth.